Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We assume that modern society has, killed God and replaced him with this purely atheistic, rational, and scientific worldview. But the data shows the exact opposite. As traditional belief in God drops, belief in ghosts, magic, and demons is actually skyrocketing. Today we are diving into why the supposedly secular world is actually obsessed with the supernatural, exploring rising exorcism rates, the myth of the perfectly faithful past, and the deeply intertwined history of atheism and the occult. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So, to kick off this deep dive, it's such a weird paradox, right?
Yeah, it really is a profound irony, especially when you look at the broad historical narrative we've all been sold. We've been handed this very specific linear story about human progress.
Right, the idea that as microscopes and telescopes got better, magic just disappeared.
Exactly. It suggests that as technology improved, our belief in the unseen simply vanished. But the research we're looking at today argues that this narrative is, well, largely a fiction.
And the core of our deep dive today really focuses on the research of Dr. Jason A. Josephson-Storm. We're looking at this really in-depth interview he gave regarding his extensive work on secularization.
Right, and his primary mission here is to deconstruct what he calls the myth of disenchantment.
Which is basically the assumption that science and atheism acted as this massive societal vacuum cleaner, right?
Yep.
Like just sucking all the magic, the mystery, and the spiritual entities right out of the modern world.
That's a great way to put it. To understand why this myth is so pervasive, we really have to look at early secularization theory. Because for decades, the dominant sociological framework predicted this straightforward march toward an age of pure empirical rationality.
So they thought everyone was just going to become an atheist who only believes in rational science.
Right. The assumption was that belief systems were a package deal. Sociologists theorized that once a society stopped going to church or abandoned the concept of a monotheistic God, all the secondary supernatural beliefs would naturally evaporate alongside it.
Like ghosts, demons, curses.
Yeah, magical thinking in general, they thought it would all just go away.
But the data provided in these sources paints a completely different picture. We aren't seeing a parallel decline at all.
No, not at all. We are actually seeing an inverse correlation. So as traditional religious affiliation drops, that often coincides with a measurable spike in paranormal belief.
Which is wild. And the Czech Republic is like the perfect case study for this, right?
It really is. By almost every demographic metric, the Czech Republic ranks as an incredibly atheistic nation. Formal affiliation with traditional religious institutions is exceedingly low there.
So if the old theory held up, they should be this bastion of strict materialist rationality.
Exactly. But sociological surveys reveal massive rates of belief in paranormal phenomena, fortune-telling, and magic. Their belief rates in these supernatural categories are highly comparable to, and in some metrics actually exceed, those in the United States.
That's just fascinating. Let's break down the mechanics of how that actually works in the mind of a modern person. Take a demographic like the knowns in the U.S.
Ah, right, the unaffiliated.
Yeah, the people who check the no affiliation box on a census, or who identify strictly as agnostic or atheist, we assume they view the universe as nothing more than atoms and void. But when you dig into the surveys, they are actively engaging with astrology, tarot, or the concept of spiritual energies.
Yeah, it's a real cognitive dissonance. The sources introduce this fascinating psychological concept from Japanese sociology, often translated as half-belief.
Half-belief, like you kind of believe it, but kind of don't.
Basically, yeah. We tend to categorize human belief as a binary on-off switch. But human psychology is much more fluid. If you ask people in a highly modernized society if they believe in ghosts, many operate in this state of half-belief.
Oh, I see. So they might intellectually acknowledge that a scientific worldview precludes spirits, but they'll still, read their horoscope.
Right, or avoid walking under a ladder, or wear an amulet to ward off bad energy.
Think about your own life for a second, right? Have you ever knocked on wood so you wouldn't jinx a good situation? You probably don't literally believe a tree spirit is listening to you, but you perform the ritual anyway.
Exactly. That just-in-case mentality is exactly what the data is capturing. And when we look at the hard numbers for the United States, that half-belief scales up to an astonishing level.
Yeah, the stats here are crazy.
They really are. According to comprehensive polling, like the Baylor Religion Survey, roughly 90% of Americans believe in God or a higher power. However, if you broaden the lens to a category of spirits,
A staggering 83% of the population holds supernatural beliefs.
right, Digging into the specifics, about 55% of people believe they have been actively protected by a guardian angel. 53% believe in the reality of demonic possession, and a full 50% believe in ghosts.
It's as if society emptied the house of traditional monotheism. But instead of leaving it perfectly clean and empty, we just filled the rooms with ghosts, demons, and healing crystals.
That analogy perfectly captures the sociological shift, honestly. We haven't stopped believing in the unseen. We have simply decentralized it.
The structural architecture of traditional religion is gone, but the inhabitants are still there.
Roaming freely through the culture, exactly.
Which brings us to a massive point of friction. If people are keeping the ghosts and the demons, but losing the traditional organized religious structures that historically managed those entities, what happens when those beliefs cause actual psychological distress?
Well, this leads directly to a phenomenon highlighted in the research that seems completely counterintuitive for the 21st century.
The massive surge in exorcisms.
Yeah. It sounds like something out of the medieval era, but the demand for exorcisms has been climbing sharply and steadily since the 1970s.
I think the sources cite an Atlantic article about an Indianapolis Catholic exorcist, right?
Yes, detailing his experience. Early in his tenure, he was fielding perhaps 5 requests a week. Recently, that number has jumped to roughly 30 requests a week.
Wow. To put that in perspective, that is someone calling a modern American church every few hours, genuinely believing they, or a loved one, is inhabited by a demonic entity. But this isn't just a localized Catholic issue, is it?
Not at all. The Catholic Church actually has a highly formalized bureaucratic process for this. They require extensive investigation before an exorcism is approved. The truly explosive growth is occurring within Pentecostal and charismatic movements.
Especially across the global south, right?
Exactly. This movement operates in a much more decentralized, localized manner.
The sources highlight Brazil as a major flashpoint for this. Can we examine the theological warfare happening there? Because I feel like it perfectly illustrates what happens when different supernatural belief systems collide in a modern setting.
Absolutely. In Brazil, you have rapidly expanding Pentecostal communities living in close proximity to practitioners of indigenous and Afro-Caribbean traditions such as Candomblé or Santeria.
And they have a very different view of spiritual possession.
Very different. Within these Afro-Caribbean frameworks, practitioners venerate spiritual entities known as orishas. These include figures like Ogun, who is associated with iron and warfare, or Urzuli, associated with love and beauty.
And in their tradition, becoming possessed by an orisha during a ritual is actually the ultimate spiritual goal, isn't it?
Yes, it is a deeply positive, welcomed experience that confers blessings on the community.
So one group sees a person entering a trance state and views it as a divine blessing. How does the Pentecostal community next door interpret that exact same event?
They view it through a lens of absolute spiritual warfare. The Pentecostal theology categorizes those exact same orishas not as alternative deities, but as literal, active demons.
Oh, wow. So you end up with this intense cultural clash.
Exactly. One community celebrates a divine possession, while their immediate neighbors feel compelled to perform aggressive exorcisms to cast out what they perceive as absolute evil.
This brings us to a highly sensitive intersection of religion, culture, and modern medicine. The sources delve into the work of anthropologist Felicitas Goodman.
Yes, who investigated the infamous 1970s case of Anneliese Michel in Germany.
Right, the case that inspired the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose.
Right, and Dr. Josephson-Storm actually shares this as a piece of his own family history, because Goodman was his grandmother.
Oh, that's a fascinating connection.
Yeah. Anneliese Michel was a young woman who underwent a grueling series of public exorcisms while simultaneously being treated with antipsychotic medications. She ultimately stopped eating and tragically died.
Which led to a major legal debate regarding culpability, understandably.
Yes, and the sources present Goodman's subsequent theory on this, which really challenges our standard medical approach.
According to her research, what was actually happening globally in cases like this?
Goodman theorized that people across different societies frequently enter what she termed cultural trance states. These are deep, dissociative states, heavily influenced by the specific religious vocabulary of their culture.
Okay, so it's shaped by what they already believe.
Exactly. Her controversial conclusion was that when modern medicine attempts to treat a culturally induced possession state strictly with standard psychiatric medication,
treating it solely as a neurochemical imbalance like schizophrenia.
Right. The treatment frequently fails to bring the person out of the trance.
Okay, let me offer some strong pushback here. Because romanticizing these trance states seems potentially dangerous. I mean, if someone is suffering from a severe underlying psychotic disorder, isn't it highly irresponsible to suggest that an archaic ritual like an exorcism might be more effective than antipsychotic medication, regardless of their cultural background?
That is the exact ethical tension the medical community struggles with. But the sources aren't suggesting that modern psychiatry should be abandoned in favor of folk rituals.
Okay, so what is the argument then?
Rather, Goodman's anthropological argument is that human psychology is deeply entwined with cultural narratives. When a mind enters a dissociative state built upon a specific cultural vocabulary of demons and spirits, the medication might address the brain chemistry.
But it doesn't provide a psychological resolution to the narrative the person is experiencing.
Exactly. She argued that in some cases, patients require the specific culturally believed ritual, the exorcism, to serve as a psychological off-ramp. It's a definitive signal to their own mind that the ordeal is over.
That concept of a cultural vocabulary raises another fascinating question. If these trance states rely on the vocabulary available to the sufferer, what role does modern media play?
A huge role.
Because The Exorcist comes out in 1973, it becomes a massive global phenomenon. Is there a pop culture feedback loop happening here? Did secular people and believers alike become primed to interpret severe mental distress specifically as demonic possession because Hollywood provided them with that script?
The sources strongly suggest that this feedback loop is highly active. We consistently underestimate how media shapes our subconscious framing of trauma.
So the movie essentially trained people on how to be possessed.
In a way, yes. Once The Exorcist embedded the specific aesthetics and behaviors of demonic possession into the global zeitgeist, it provided a readily available narrative framework. When people experience extreme psychological distress, the human mind desperately searches for an explanation. It reaches for the most potent cultural script available.
It is a dark form of supply and demand. Pop culture supplies the concept of the demon, and the distressed human mind demands an explanation for its suffering.
Precisely. And this points to a larger flaw in how we view ourselves today versus how we view our ancestors.
How so?
We look at this modern feedback loop of horror movies and healing crystals, and we contrast it against an imagined age of faith in the past. We assume everyone back then was purely rational in their theology, universally faithful, and orthodox in their beliefs.
Right, we picture the Middle Ages as a time when everyone walked around in monastic robes, perfectly dedicated to the church. Now, anyone who studies history knows the flat earth medieval peasant is largely a 19th century myth, right? Invented to make modern people feel intellectually superior.
Yes, that's completely fabricated.
But the witch trials are a perfect example of how we misremember the timeline of magical belief, aren't they?
They absolutely are. When asked, most people place the brutal witch-hunting crazes squarely in the Dark Ages. But historical records show that the mass persecutions of witches were primarily a 16th and 17th century phenomenon.
Wait, so that's way later.
Right. They peaked right alongside the Renaissance and the dawn of the scientific revolution. The exact same era that gave us advanced astronomy, calculus, and early physics also saw thousands of people burned at the stake for supposed black magic.
So the growth of rational science and the intense formalized belief in dark magic were literally occurring side by side.
Yes. The historical reality is that early European peasants were surprisingly skeptical or deeply steeped in pagan folk practices. There was no clean dividing line between approved theology and local magic.
We tend to picture historical belief as this perfect, unified choir singing hymns in a cathedral. But based on the sources, it was more like a chaotic cafeteria where people were piling paganism, folk magic, and official church doctrine onto the exact same plate.
That cafeteria analogy is incredibly accurate. You would have a peasant who would see no contradiction in going to a pagan sacred grove on a Tuesday to pray to a tree spirit for a good harvest.
And then attending a Christian basilica on Sunday to take the Eucharist.
Exactly. The idea of pure Christianization, that an entire continent was doctrinally pure and perfectly disenchanted, is a historical illusion. It was incredibly porous.
Even the major religious reforms didn't necessarily drive out the magic.
Yeah.
I mean, sociologists like Max Weber historically argued that Protestantism helped disenchant the world, right?
Right.
By stripping away the mysticism and the relics of Catholicism.
Right, but Weber's theory is heavily critiqued in modern sociology for that exact reason. Early Protestantism did not banish the spiritual realm. In many ways, it intensified it.
Like Martin Luther throwing ink at the devil.
Exactly. The catalyst of the Reformation famously threw an inkwell across his room at what he perceived to be the literal, physical manifestation of the devil.
So by removing the buffer of the Catholic priesthood, Protestantism placed the individual directly on the front lines of a cosmic spiritual war.
It arguably increased the daily belief in diabolical intervention rather than getting rid of it.
So if humanity has consistently maintained this chaotic, deeply intertwined relationship with the spiritual, from the pagan peasant to Martin Luther, all the way to the modern agnostic buying tarot cards, how do our modern, purely secular institutions handle ecstatic experiences today?
That's the big question.
Because if someone walks into a clinic today claiming to hear the voice of a spiritual entity, we certainly don't call an exorcist. We immediately pathologize it.
Right, we attempt to aggressively medicalize the divine. The sources argue that since the era of Sigmund Freud, secular society has frequently defaulted to equating intense religious, mystical, or ecstatic behavior with mental illness.
Dr. Josephson-Storm characterizes this as a philosophical evasion, doesn't it?
He does. It's a cop-out.
It seems like historians are constantly applying a modern materialist framework backwards onto history, too. You frequently read theories attempting to diagnose historical figures without any empirical proof.
Oh, all the time. They will claim that the Apostle Paul or Jesus must have simply suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy.
Or that the Oracle of Delphi was just hallucinating because she was inhaling toxic fumes from a geological fault line.
It happens constantly, and it is a way to dismiss profound human experiences without having to seriously engage with their philosophical implications. However, pioneers of early psychology, such as William James, argued fiercely against this reductionist view.
What did James argue?
He posited that ordinary, healthy human consciousness is perfectly capable of producing profound, mystical, and ecstatic experiences completely on its own. You do not need a brain lesion, pharmacological intervention, or a mental illness to touch the transcendent.
The capacity for spiritual ecstasy is just a natural, inherent feature of the human mind. But don't modern neuroscientists claim to have mapped this out? We constantly see articles claiming that researchers using brain scans have found the God center of the brain, implying that spiritual experiences are just localized neurochemical misfires.
The sources urge a high degree of skepticism regarding those studies. Modern neurology attempts to map religious experience using fMRI machines, but the methodology is often deeply flawed.
In what way?
Well, the technology itself has significant error rates when attempting highly specific functional mapping of complex emotions. Furthermore, you have to look at the sample populations.
Who are they actually scanning?
These studies frequently rely on very small groups of American college students who participate for course credit.
Oh, wow. So they're using the localized brain scan of a 20-year-old undergrad to definitively explain the ecstatic visions of a 14th century mystic.
Yeah, which is scientifically precarious, to say the least.
That's crazy. This brings us to a major philosophical concept in the sources, Charles Taylor's idea of the buffered self.
Right. Taylor, a prominent philosopher, wrote a highly influential book called A Secular Age. He argued that modern humans have developed a buffered self.
Meaning our reliance on science has built psychological walls protecting us from the spiritual world.
Yes. He contrasted this with pre-modern people who supposedly had a porous self that allowed spirits and demons to constantly influence them.
But the data we explored earlier completely dismantles that premise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if 83% of Americans believe in spirits and exorcism rates are surging, we are clearly not buffered.
Exactly the point the researchers make. Humanity remains incredibly porous to the unseen. We haven't subtracted belief from our culture at all. We have simply updated the vocabulary.
So a modern person in a secular city might not use the word demon, but they will speak earnestly about cutting out toxic energies or absorbing bad vibes.
Or the power of manifesting their reality through thought. The underlying psychological mechanism is identical.
Let me pose a theory on this entire process of medicalization. Is the rush by modern psychiatry to clinicalize every single spiritual or ecstatic experience actually just the modern atheist's version of an exorcism?
What do you mean by that?
Is the act of diagnosing someone, giving their experience a sterile Latin medical name, the ritual we perform to cast out the uncomfortable reality of the unexplainable?
You know, if we look at the sociological function of rituals, that is a profound insight. Providing a clinical diagnosis offers the exact same psychological comfort and illusion of control to the secular materialist that the exorcism provides to the religious believer.
It takes the chaotic, terrifying unknown of the human experience, places it in a neat categorical box, and declares, We have authority over this.
In many ways, clinical medicalization serves as the modern ritual of disenchantment.
Think about what this means for you, the listener, as you navigate the modern world. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, and it fundamentally alters how we should view our society.
It really does.
We started by exploring how atheism and scientific progress didn't kill magical thinking. They merely redistributed it. As the traditional structures of God and the Church wane, human beings naturally and immediately fill the resulting void with ghosts, spirits, energies, and new rituals.
The purely secular world we assume we live in is a total myth.
Right. We are just as enchanted, just as mystical, and just as deeply complex as that skeptical peasant standing in the chaotic cafeteria of medieval beliefs. We simply emptied our house of traditional monotheism and filled it right back up with crystals, horoscopes, and modern exorcisms.
It reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. We possess an enduring, hardwired hunger for the transcendent. We are not merely rational, calculating machines processing empirical data.
We are meaning-making creatures.
Exactly. Whenever old systems of meaning are dismantled, we do not rest in the void. We immediately begin constructing new pantheons from whatever cultural materials are readily available.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to carry with you. If human beings are psychologically hardwired to fill this atheistic void with supernatural entities, what future gods or spirits are we actively creating right now?
That's the real question.
As we pour our deepest hopes, fears, and unchecked faith into artificial intelligence, the algorithm, and modern technology, wait, let me rephrase that. Are we simply building the new spirits that will possess the minds of the next generation?
When you look at how people already speak about the ghost in the machine, that is a truly haunting question to consider.
It absolutely is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking deeper.